In the silent space of the kitchen, Elena felt the cold air brushing her skin as she collapsed onto the floor, her breath coming in sharp gasps, unable to suppress the painful coughs. A metal tray fell to the ground, its echo as sharp and unforgiving as a gunshot. She struggled to rise, but her weary legs couldn't support her fragile body. Briggs, the ruthless manager, stood there, staring at Elena with cold eyes, no trace of empathy. A half-smile appeared on his lips as he reached out, coldly saying, "Get up. It's nothing serious." His voice echoed in the quiet room, interrupting Elena's thoughts. The other staff around her dared not speak. One of them, Matteo, saw Elena sitting motionless, feeling the pain she couldn't voice. "If someone dies here, no one will care," he whispered, his voice tinged with sorrow, as if he too were suffering from this injustice. As the light from outside the room streamed in, the laughter from families dining at the buffet filled the air, with jokes and the clinking of plates. It all seemed so far removed from the reality Elena was facing. She sat dazed on a plastic crate, her eyes vacant, her body trembling. She couldn't express what she was feeling. The reality was too cruel. But Jackson, the supervisor, had noticed something wrong. This story wasn't just about another ordinary workday. It was the journey of a man, a CEO, seeking justice for himself and those around him. Jackson Hale wasn't a heartless character, but rather a man who had forgotten the original ideals he once held dear. Staring at the screen in his office, he couldn't tear his eyes away from the words that felt like a warning. "One day, someone will die in this kitchen, and no one will care." These words dug deep into Jackson's mind, forcing him to face a painful truth. The indifference that had overshadowed the lives of the workers he once thought were protected. The cold light from the desk lamp cast shadows on Jackson's face, making him appear like a ghost in a room surrounded by glass and steel. Sitting behind his polished desk, the words on his computer screen glistened like sharp cuts in his mind. "One day someone will die in this kitchen, and no one will care." The phrase repeated itself in Jackson's head, suffocating him with a sense of dread that overwhelmed his heart. The silence in the office was almost unbearable. The white glow of the computer screen did little to warm the emotions building inside Jackson. He looked up at an old photograph on his desk, a picture of himself from many years ago. A younger, tired, and resilient Jackson, with hands covered in sweat and scars from the days of hard work. He remembered the times he had to clean, cook, and work tirelessly at a small restaurant, where every day was an endless battle just to survive. Back then, Jackson had sworn that when he could stand in this position, he would never allow anyone to endure what he had. He would protect them, lift them up. But now, with his empire in place, he realized that he had gone too far. Everything had changed. The ideals he once held were now nothing more than empty promises, swept away by numbers and career advancement. The next series of messages on the screen were like heavy stones weighing down his mind. Endless working hours, employees quitting regularly, no changes, complaints vanish. Jackson clenched his fists, the feeling of suffocation rising in his chest. He had allowed empathetic calls to vanish behind the cold walls of his luxury offices, leaving the workers voiceless in his life. They had been caught in the whirlwind, working endlessly for a meager salary without any respect. "I've let this go too far," Jackson silently told himself. He couldn't let anyone else suffer like this. The decision was clear in his mind, and the only thing left was to act. He hit the call button, his voice cold when he answered the HR department. "I want to register as an intern. My name is Frank." A faint cough came from the other end of the line, seemingly in disbelief at what they had just heard. But Jackson didn't wait. He hung up the phone immediately, not letting the person's doubt weaken his resolve. Without another moment's hesitation, he stood up from his desk, opened his closet, not to grab his expensive suits, but instead pulled out an old shirt, worn-out pants, and shoes with scuffed soles. Each item he put on felt like a piece of armor, a painful yet determined step forward. He ran a hand over his face, looking at his reflection. He was no longer Jackson Hale, the CEO of this empire. He was a man going back to the basics. This was an unavoidable step. Jackson turned, walking out of his office, but before the door closed behind him, he glanced back one last time at the computer screen. Despite all the warnings and the messages full of employee dissatisfaction, he couldn't stop now. He had to do this to reclaim his conscience. When Jackson first stepped into the Southgate kitchen, everything around him was completely different from what he had imagined. The dim lighting, the heavy air filled with the smell of frying oil, and the clanging noises from the kitchen equipment all surrounded him like the screams of a massive machine. The scent of food, sweat, and the intense heat made him feel dizzy. He had once stood in luxurious meeting rooms, but now standing in this kitchen, he felt like a stranger, an outsider who didn't belong. Briggs, the kitchen manager, glanced at Jackson from head to toe, his face expressionless, showing no sign of friendliness. "New here?" Briggs said flatly. "Just follow the instructions. Don't cause trouble." Jackson nodded but immediately realized that no one was paying attention to him. The workers around him were like ghosts, their eyes downcast, lifeless, simply going through the motions of their work as if they were machines without feelings. The sounds of the kitchen grew louder around him, trapping Jackson in a confined space with no escape. The workers never stopped. No one paused, no one spoke. They could only feel the heat, the exhaustion, and the burn marks from the relentless work. Each person had their own story, but now they were all suffocating under the weight of fatigue and deprivation. Briggs walked past Jackson without a second glance, barking orders at the staff as if they were tools, not people. Jackson surveyed the kitchen, his gaze landing on Mateo, a young worker who was hurriedly moving heavy trays. His hands were burned, yet he continued working, his eyes glued to his task. Mateo's hands were red, cracked, and bleeding, but he dared not complain. It seemed like an unwritten rule here. No one was allowed to complain, no one was allowed to take a break. Not only Mateo, but Leora and Elena were the same. Leora, a frail woman, still had to face this harsh reality. Elena, her eyes tired, still forced to smile at customers, despite her body nearing its breaking point. Looking at them, Jackson's heart ached. The people he once thought of as necessary sacrifices for the operation of his company were now the ones who had to endure without end. And at that moment, Jackson realized something important. They had once been invisible in his eyes, but now they were the ones he could no longer ignore. "We can't keep going like this," Jackson silently told himself, but he couldn't speak the words. He was the CEO, but he was frank in this moment, and this new role needed action. What Jackson did next was approach Mateo. He looked at his burned hands, at the untreated wounds, and couldn't remain silent. He took a towel to wipe the sweat off his forehead, gently but firmly took Mateo's hand. "Today will be the beginning of a change," Jackson said, his eyes full of pain. "You are not just tools, you are human." Mateo looked up at him, his eyes beginning to brighten, as though he had never seen respect from his manager before. The atmosphere in the kitchen grew heavier. The clattering of dishes, the hum of machinery, and Briggs' commands only served to highlight one painful reality. This was not a job, it was a life being stripped away, piece by piece. The employees, tirelessly working, continued in silence. They were like ghosts, exhausted and desperate. None of them daring to speak, none of them daring to resist. Jackson stood there, silently observing everything from a corner of the kitchen. He could feel the change in the atmosphere. Every glance from the workers, every tired face, seemed to carry one big question. Will anyone see us? Will anyone care about this pain? The arms reddened from working under high temperatures, the burn marks from hot oil, the trembling hands from exhaustion. All of it lay before Jackson. He couldn't help but think of the long days Mateo had endured, his hands bloodied, his shoulders aching. But still, he worked. Not just Mateo, but Leora and Elena too. Leora, a frail woman, had to face the harsh realities, while Elena, though her eyes were heavy with fatigue, still tried to smile at customers, despite her body being close to breaking down. Seeing them, Jackson's heart tightened. The people he once considered necessary sacrifices for the company's operations were now the ones bearing the brunt of it all. And at that moment, Jackson realized something. They had once been invisible to him, but now they were the ones he couldn't ignore. "What are we doing here?" Jackson asked himself, his hand clenched tightly. "We can't let this continue." The guilt began to creep into him, but that didn't stop him from stepping out of the shadows. He had to act, had to do something to end this cruelty. Suddenly, he felt an intense urge, a feeling he hadn't experienced in a long time. He couldn't stand by and watch this anymore. He couldn't continue to let these workers suffer without respect. Then he saw Elena. She was standing in the kitchen, her pale face, hands trembling as she held a meat cleaver. Even though she tried to smile at the customers, Jackson could see the exhaustion in her eyes. He couldn't bear to see the fragile woman being crushed by the weight of her work. He approached quietly, making sure not to draw attention. When he reached her, he gently placed his hand on her shoulder, his voice soft yet firm. "You need a break. Go rest for a bit, Elena. I'll cover for you." Elena looked up, stunned. She couldn't believe what she was hearing, but she just nodded silently, quietly leaving the kitchen, as if her steps were those of someone who had been exhausted by life for too long. Jackson watched her leave, his heart heavy. He knew she would return to the kitchen as soon as she could. Because of money, because of her family, because of survival. But this couldn't go on. No one should have to live like this. Suddenly, Briggs's laughter rang out from the other side. Jackson turned to see the kitchen manager, clipboard in hand, observing the scene with a smug smile. "Well, Frank," Briggs spoke, using Jackson's fake name, "how's it feel to do the work of those below you?" Jackson didn't answer immediately. He just stared at Briggs, his anger building. That smile of Briggs was no longer one of pride, but of contempt. But Jackson wouldn't let this go on. He knew that now was the time to act. "My job isn't the work of those below you," Jackson replied in a low, steady voice. "My job is to make the system fairer, to help those who have been forgotten." Briggs laughed, but the mockery in his laughter only strengthened Jackson's resolve. "What?" Briggs scoffed. "Help? You don't get it, Frank. You don't know anything about this work." Jackson didn't respond. He walked out of the kitchen and straight to the HR department. He knew it was time to do something bigger, not just change the kitchen, but the entire system. He couldn't keep watching as these workers were exploited and treated like tools with no value. Tomorrow, Jackson would no longer be the CEO. He would be the one fighting for them, for the people who had been stripped of everything. He would step into this battle like a soldier, with nothing left to lose but justice. The next morning, Jackson woke up with a strange feeling, as if a new door had opened in his mind. The thoughts from the previous night were no longer vague concerns, but a clear goal, a decision that could no longer be delayed. He was no longer the man of compromise, no longer someone who would accept cruelty, and he certainly wouldn't let it continue in the company he had built. He looked into the mirror in his bathroom. The reflection staring back was a man who had changed, no longer Jackson Hale, the CEO of a large empire, but a man who now carried a responsibility not just for himself, but for the workers who had been forgotten. He looked into his own eyes and felt a powerful surge rise within him. Not today anymore, he murmured to himself, then returned to his office. The familiar feel of his desk, the cold reflective glass walls, but now they no longer gave him any sense of safety. He had grown too familiar with the loneliness of this office, too accustomed to being disconnected from the world outside, from the people he had once overlooked. But now was not the time to return to that endless cycle. Jackson sat down at his desk, opened his laptop, and stared at the financial reports. The numbers could bring him wealth, but it was also these same numbers that had made him forget his true purpose, to change the lives of the workers. He took a deep breath and made a call. A few short conversations helped him arrange an important meeting for that morning. He knew he had to act immediately. At Southgate, the atmosphere was still as heavy as the day before. The sounds of the kitchen echoed through the building, but today there was a difference. The workers no longer lowered their heads when Briggs walked by. They no longer shrank in fear of his presence. Jackson had made his decision, and that decision had reached them. Briggs stood there, yelling at a few workers over a trivial mistake. But this time, Jackson couldn't stay silent. He walked into the kitchen, his presence drawing the attention of everyone. Even the most exhausted workers, those who had just finished long hours, felt the shift. Jackson stood tall, walking in like a person who truly had power, not because of his CEO title, but because of the integrity he now carried. "Briggs," Jackson spoke, his voice steady and firm, "we need to talk." Everyone in the kitchen stopped. They knew this conversation was different. Briggs turned, his face showing clear surprise, then defensive. "What is it?" he replied, trying to sound calm. "We can't keep doing this," Jackson said, stepping closer. This company has for too long treated its workers like machines. I won't let this continue. A few of the workers exchanged glances, their eyes lighting up with a spark of hope, but also tinged with worry. They didn't know if Jackson had the strength to change anything. Briggs, however, wasn't about to back down. He sneered. "So what? Just a dream, Jackson," Briggs mocked. Jackson didn't answer immediately. He opened a folder on his desk and flipped through a few pages. Numbers, cost reports, wages, and schedules. He pointed to one particular report. "We'll start by refunding the wages that have been stolen for those extra hours that haven't been compensated, and I will ensure that this company will begin treating every employee with the respect they deserve." His words were strong and decisive, but there was also the serious tone of someone who had made up their mind. Briggs stared at Jackson, but the room fell silent. Jackson knew that not everyone would immediately understand what was happening. Some in the room would feel threatened by this change because they were used to a system of high profits and low costs, where the workers' efforts weren't valued. But for Jackson, that no longer mattered. He had made his decision, and he wouldn't turn back. "We won't just change the way we work," Jackson continued. "We'll change the culture of this company. We'll treat every employee like a person, not a tool, and we'll create a workplace where they can contribute and feel respected." After a few moments of silence, one of the managers spoke up, his voice full of skepticism. "But if we change too much, won't that affect the company's profits?" Jackson smiled lightly, unshaken. "Profit is important, but it's not the only goal. If we don't have happy employees, healthy employees, and motivated workers, then this company won't last long. We'll build a solid foundation where employees feel valued, and then the profits will come." No one in the room spoke after that, but Jackson could see the change in their eyes. Some began to realize that this wasn't just about immediate profits. It was about the long-term sustainability of the company. He knew the process of change would take time, but this was the path he had chosen, and he wouldn't look back. Jackson stood still, looking at the heavy atmosphere that filled the kitchen. The workers here were no longer invisible. They were no longer forced to work in silence and exhaustion. But he knew that this change couldn't come easily. It needed to be a process, a long-term commitment, with the first steps being those that would restore the values that had been lost. First, he looked at the weary faces around him. Elena, Matteo, Leora, they had all endured too much, but still stood there, resilient in their work. A few words of encouragement from Jackson might not be enough to change everything, but at least it would be a signal to them that someone truly cared about them. "We're going to start from here," Jackson said, his voice soft yet determined. "Today is our first day. Today, none of you will work without getting paid fairly. No one will have to work long night shifts without proper rest. You will have proper working conditions." Every eye in the kitchen stopped, and the workers who had once kept their heads down now began to lift them. A glimmer of hope sparked within them. Jackson's words were not just empty encouragement. They were a commitment, a promise that he would make sure they had a better life. He wouldn't let them continue to live in a world of indifference and suffering. He continued, his voice growing more resolute. "Every contract will be honored. You will be paid for the overtime hours you've worked. And most importantly, you won't have to work in an environment that disrespects your efforts." Elena, who was still standing nearby, felt the change. She looked at Jackson, her eyes red from exhaustion, but there was a flicker of hope in them. She stepped closer, softly saying, Can you really change everything? Will we really be treated fairly?" Jackson smiled gently, his eyes softening as he looked at Elena. "I didn't see what you all were going through before, but from today, I'll see everything. You all deserve respect, and I'll do everything I can to make that happen." In the stillness of the room, Jackson's promise wasn't just words. It was a commitment that no one could take away. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, and there would be challenges, but he couldn't turn back now. He wouldn't let these workers endure another day in a world that had stripped them of their dignity. After that morning, Jackson walked silently, leaving behind a workplace no longer filled with fear and silence. What needed to change had already begun, and Jackson understood that every step he took would bring long-lasting change for all the workers who had endured so much. The next morning, Jackson stood in the meeting room, facing the senior managers of Southgate. The light from the windows streamed in, but the atmosphere in the room no longer felt cold and dull. There seemed to be a shift, though not everyone might notice it. Still, Jackson could feel the difference in every breath. "It's time we face the truth," Jackson began, his voice calm but powerful. "In the past years, we've built an empire from what was available, but we've forgotten that the price of success can't be paid with the sacrifice of those who work for us." The managers in the room said nothing. They listened in silence. Jackson looked at their faces, but his eyes didn't just stop there. He thought of the workers in the kitchen. Elena, Matteo, Leora, and all those who had been tied to Southgate but never shown the respect they deserved. He knew what he had to do to change it all. "We need a new system," Jackson continued. "A system where everyone working here can feel their own worth. Every hour they work will be acknowledged, and every effort will never be belittled again." Across the room, the managers began to look at each other, their faces clearly puzzled. They had never heard these words from a CEO before. Jackson could feel the change in the air, and it only made him more determined. He knew he couldn't just change small things. He had to change the whole system, bringing in core principles of fairness and respect. "We'll start by resetting the work hours, wages, and how we treat our employees," Jackson said, looking directly at each person in the room, his gaze unwavering. "From today, no one here will live in the conditions the workers have had to endure. They won't have to work 16 hours a day. They won't have to live in fear of being reprimanded for a minor mistake." Jackson's words hung in the air, making the room feel heavier. He knew not everyone would agree with him immediately. Some of the people in the room would feel threatened by this change because they had become accustomed to a system of high profits and low costs, where the workers' contributions were undervalued. But to Jackson, that no longer mattered. He had made his decision, and there was no turning back. "We won't just change how we work," he continued. "We will change the company culture. We will treat each employee as a person, not a tool, and we'll create a workplace where they can contribute and feel respected." After a few moments of silence, one of the managers spoke, his voice filled with skepticism. "But if we change too much, will that affect the company's profits?" Jackson smiled slightly, undeterred. "Profit is important, but it's not the only goal. If we don't have happy employees, healthy employees, and motivated workers, then this company won't last. We'll build a solid foundation where employees feel valued, and then the profits will follow." No one in the room spoke after that, but Jackson could see the change in their eyes. Some were beginning to realize that this wasn't just about immediate profits. It was about the long-term sustainability of the company. He knew that the process of change would take time, but this was the path he had chosen, and he wasn't going to turn back. The next day, Jackson was no longer the CEO everyone knew. He no longer sat behind his luxurious desk in the cold office, no longer immersed in numbers and financial strategies. Today, Jackson was Frank, an ordinary worker stepping into the Southgate kitchen to witness the truth he had long ignored. As he entered the kitchen, there were no greetings, no curious glances. Everyone was immersed in their tasks, none of them noticing the change in Jackson's face. He quietly stood in the corner of the kitchen, observing. The scene was no different from the others he had seen before. The smell of oil, the sizzling of pans, the clinking of knives on chopping boards, all of it created an atmosphere of exhaustion and tension. Briggs, as usual, was sitting behind the control desk, his eyes fixed on the screen. Jackson observed this manager. He was still unchanged, his voice sharp, indifferent to the people sweating in the stifling kitchen. "Everything fine?" Jackson spoke, but this time he was no longer the CEO. He was just Frank, a worker trying to understand what his employees went through every day. Briggs glanced at Jackson, not responding immediately, a look of disdain in his eyes before he returned to his work. "Don't worry, we'll get by. Just work as usual." He sighed as if he had grown too accustomed to the sacrifices of everyone under him. Frank continued to observe. Matteo, one of the longtime workers, was struggling to carry heavy trays, his hands filled with hot plates. Though a strong man, the exhaustion was evident on his face. Jackson couldn't help but think about the long days Matteo had endured, his hands bloody, his shoulders aching. But still, he worked. Not just Matteo, But Leora and Elena too. Leora, frail as she was, still faced the harsh realities. Elena, her eyes weary, still tried to smile at customers despite her body being on the brink of collapse. Seeing them, Jackson's heart tightened. The people he had once seen as necessary sacrifices for the company's operation were now the ones who had to endure without end. And in that moment, Jackson realized something. They had once been invisible to him, but now they were the ones he could no longer ignore. "We can't keep going like this," Jackson told himself silently, but he couldn't speak the words. He was the CEO, but now he was Frank, and this new role had to take action. What Jackson did next was approach Mateo. He looked at Mateo's burned hands, at the untreated wounds, and couldn't remain silent. He took a towel to wipe the sweat off his forehead, gently yet firmly taking Mateo's hand. "Today will be the beginning of change," Jackson said, his eyes full of pain. "You are not just tools. You are human." Mateo looked up at him, his eyes beginning to brighten, as if he had never seen respect from his manager before. Key point: Jackson, in the role of Frank, decides to step into the kitchen to witness the harshness that his employees face every day. He begins to realize the cruelty of the system he has created and is determined to change it, starting by showing respect and understanding for his employees. Thank you for following this story with us. If you found this video inspiring or it helped you see life in a new light, don't forget to leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your feedback. And if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, be sure to hit subscribe so you don't miss any exciting and meaningful videos in the future. Thank you again, and we'll see you in the next videos. Wishing you strength and confidence on your journey.